When you look at the policy drivers behind tax reform, it's all about bringing capital, jobs, facilities back to the U.S. And so what does that mean for M&A? That means there's more capital here, there's more liquidity here in the U.S., and so I think it still remains to be seen what all that capital and what all that liquidity is going to be used for. Is it going to be used to fuel M&A? Is it going to be used to fuel stock buybacks, bonus plans for large organizations, for employees? There's a number of different things, but really what is driving tax reform is bringing things back to the U.S. So one of the beneficiaries of that is M&A. Under the pre-tax reform regime with overseas businesses, there's been what we call a lockout effect with foreign earnings, overseas earnings, and so as we've moved from a worldwide tax regime with this offshore cash, we're moving to a territorial, quasi-territorial system. There's this deemed repatriation. Everybody has to pay tax on their overseas earnings now. And so now it's much easier to move the cash back. So the lockout effect, the lockout being overseas cash, it's easier to bring it back to the U.S. When you look at the different changes in tax reform, the corporate tax rate, the reduction in individual tax rates, you look at full expensing, the pass-through deduction, what that really amounts to is there's a lighter tax burden on all these businesses. And so there's a lighter tax burden, these businesses have more cash flow, so arguably, overnight, simply as a result of tax reform, all these businesses became more valuable. That's obviously driving transaction multiples, it drives even more liquidity, even more capital available for M&A. So it's having a number of impacts on businesses and transactions. You have to understand what really drives value in your business, and then you have to overlay, not only the opportunities, but the challenges, the risks, the costs as a result of tax reform. So, for example, where do you locate new facilities? Where do you make investments? Do you engage in M&A? Do you invest in a plant? It depends on your overall business strategy, where you think you're going to get the most return on your investment, and then you have to kind of overlay, the changing tax landscape with all those different elements. With respect to portfolio companies of private equity firms, you really have to take a complete view of the portfolio company against all the different changes as a result of tax reform. And for example, when you're looking at buying a portfolio company, how you're going to buy the business, how you're going to structure the acquisition, what's the mix of capital you're going to use to buy the company, those are all impacted by tax reform. When you own the business, the type of legal entity, the tax rate scheme, whether it's a flow-through or a C corporation, full expensing, restrictions on the deductibility of interest expense, those have all changed. So you have to look at the operations of this. And then on the back end, when you're looking at a liquidity event, again, all those elements, how you bought the company, how you've owned the company, that's all going to impact ultimately how you're going to exit the company against the landscape of all the different changes. The government has promised us guidance in a number of areas. I think as we start to get that guidance from the government, you're going to see taxpayers make the plunge, if you will, restructuring their operations, where they do business, how they own companies, how they own businesses. I do think you're going to start to see some increased activity. In this first wave, in the last 4 months, really, most clients, especially public companies, they've spent most of their efforts around tax reform just trying to get into compliance with, for example, the one-time transition tax. There's a lot of tax and financial reporting issues just around that one element of tax reform by itself. And so we think that now that they're kind of past that issue, they're now ready to take on, the broader exercise of, what does tax reform really mean for the company, for the business? So, getting past the initial phase, coupled with, we anticipate, guidance coming out from the government, those two things, we think there's going to be a significant uptick in activity.